Hello, comrades. Welcome to Midwestern Marx. I'm Carlos Garrido. Today I'm going to be talking to you about Marxist materialism and how it stands different from other forms of materialism in the history of philosophy. It's this guy's 200th anniversary since his birthday, November 28th, 1920. Wow, 1820. So, yes, I don't plan on going way too deep in. I'm just going to touch the surface and give you the main ideas. But what I will do is give you all of the all of the texts. I'll give you all of the text in which you can find information concerning Marxism and specifically materialism in the body of work of Marx and Engels. Um, so yeah, let's get started. So materialism philosophically is at the heart of philosophy. Philosophy starts, or at least we're told philosophy starts, with Thales in Malaysia. Malaysia is this region by modern day Turkey, and that epoch of the pre-Socratics that starts with Thales, they are materialists. They are trying to answer questions about the cosmos, and what their methods of answering those questions are materialist. Um, well, their methods are idealists because they're thinking, but they're looking around the world to explain the questions of reality. The central questions they're asking themselves is what is the earth stuff of reality? What is that which everything else is made from? That what is the one which composes the many? What is the one that transforms and changes? And so Thales says water. From the Ephesian school, Heraclitus says fire. We have the atomist, Democritus, and then Lucretius. We have a bunch of different pre-Socratics, and they all have an appeal to matter, to the elements, eh, except for some. We have Parmenides who talks about the one, and some other figures we talk about non-elemental sort of approaches, but we have a generally materialist line of philosophy in the pre-Socratics, right? And that's approximately 400 years from 8 BC to 4 BC, where we have Plato. With Plato, we have an idealist approach, but it is an idealist approach that is not like the idealism of the metaphysics that comes later on. It is an idealism that is dynamic, that takes within it also a dialectical approach. An important thing to note is that in the Marxist tradition, as opposed to other philosophical traditions where metaphysics comes to mean the theory of all being, and being is interpreted as being as the thing in itself, right? As outside of the experience of the subject that is experiencing the world, right? Um, so we have that most famously in Kant, in his critiques and in his prolegomena of first prolegomena on the future of any metaphysics. We have this distinction between the world of phenomena, right, the world that I experience, and the world of the thing in itself, the Ding an sich. And this is not the way Marx and Engels are interpreting metaphysics, because the reality is that in this way, Aristotle and Plato and these guys would be considered metaphysicians. The way that I learned in undergrad, I went to a Catholic university, and we did a lot of Aristotle, a lot of Thomas Aquinas, and we were taught that that was metaphysics. But when you read the text of Engels and when you read Marx, you realize that they're not treating that as metaphysics. Why? Because they're interpreting metaphysics from the framework of fixation. They're interpreting metaphysics as that which gets things and holds them as if they are unchanging. That which defines beings as unchanging. So if you're going to talk about a human being, it's the unchanging ultimate human being, the universal human being that is just this way and that's it, right? The 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 Greeks, whether the pre-Socratics or Plato, Aristotle, and the ones from the period after, the Sophists and the Stoics, they all have a few points, a few philosophical perspectives that you see present in Marxism. For example, with the Stoics, you have the notion of the logos, that the world is structured rationally and that we can come to see it rationally. Well, with Engels, we have a similar quote from I believe it's either Dialectics of Nature or Anti-Düring, where he says nature is the test of the dialectics, and he talks about the two different forms of understanding dialectics. That there's objective dialectics, the way it works in the world, that the world is dynamic, and that it has these principles. All right, so right here in the Dialectics of Nature, he has the three principles of dialectics. The law of transformation of quantity to quality, I'll explain that in a bit. The law of the interpenetration of opposites, and then the law of the negation of the negation. So we have the structure of the early Greek philosophers that to some they're seen as metaphysicians, to the Marxists, and then they're seen as having a dialectical framework, right? In Mao and in Lenin, we see that for the Marxist tradition, history is essentially divided between idealism and materialism, between a metaphysical approach and a dialectical approach at understanding reality, right? And the thing is that the way these concepts are defined is in a different way in which they are defined generally in philosophy. Because in any philosophy course, you'd get taught Aristotle's metaphysics, and then Marx and Engels are not referring to him as a metaphysician. So, okay. Ooh, let me put the vibrate. So what we have is in the early Greeks, in the PreSocratics, the materialist approach. In Plato and in Aristotle, we have an idealist approach. In Aristotle, we have a more materialist approach. But we have a dialectical approach overall, right? And metaphysical or idealist in the sense of Plato is working with what's real is the realm of the forms, the realm of the ideals, right? The world here is really just an abstraction of a shallow reflection of the world of ideals, right? Aristotle is not necessarily saying that. The way he uses forms is a lot different. It's done in a more materialist manner. But what they represent in the Marxist tradition is a dialectical approach. So we have it in Phaedo, one of Plato's famous texts. He has this one nice section where he's attempting to do a proof of the immortality of the soul. And he goes into an argument which I believe is called the argument from reincarnation, in which he's talking about everything comes from his opposite. So if you're lifting and you're getting stronger, why are you stronger? Well, because you were weak. And then there's this interpenetration of opposites, and that's what allows change to happen. Every state of being is a state that is always in relation to its previous opposite. That's a dialectical approach, as we saw. One of the three main points that Engels lays out as the dialectical approach. The second one, the law of the interpenetration of opposites. We already see that in Plato's Phaedo, right? In Aristotle, we have Aristotle's notion of change as dual notions of change. We have accidental change and we have substantial change. Accidental change is a change if I take off my jacket right now, or if I shave my beard, I have changed an accidental state of being in myself. But I have not changed myself substantially. I'm still Carlos. Now, if I die, I have gone through a substantial change. This is something that it holds the seeds in a way towards, it holds the seeds for the qualities that Hegel expresses in the science of logic, and which is kind of expressed also, but more so implied, in the phenomenology of spirit. And these qualities are quantity or these categories are quantity and quality, right? And how does this work? Well, what we have here is a cup of water. What happens if we drop the temperature of the water to a point where it freezes? Well, what happens is that each degree we go down, right? And if we can break up the degrees, if you could break up the degrees, you can interpret it as each millidegree or whatever. Each degree we go down, we have a quantitative change in the state of the water. But something happens at one point when the water goes from being in a state as a liquid to a state of a solid as ice. Something happens. That's a qualitative shift. That's a qualitative leap, a qualitative change, right? If you want to think about it in the Aristotelian tradition, that is a substantial change. And it only happens because of a quantitative accumulation, right? Because we accumulated a subtraction of certain degrees, or if you want to talk about it in the other way, in how water becomes a gas and how the temperature has to elevate and sort of for the atoms to sort of they separate, right? Because that's how it works with gas. The molecular formation. I'm not a scientist, but it's more separate as opposed to a solid where the atoms are together. There's a moment in which one thing goes from liquid to gas or liquid to solid. That's one of the fundamental rules of the dialectic, and that is the rule of the transformation of quantity into quality. It is always a quantitative accumulation of something that leads to that leap of that qualitative leap. So we see this in figures as Aristotle. We see this in figures as Plato. Engels even says that we see it in figures in the East, like Buddha. There's dialectical approaches in Eastern philosophy, even in the conceptual framework and in the linguistic framework. The concepts in the West are generally more tied to thingness. The concepts in the East are generally closer to function. So already in the concepts, you already have a sort of process way of thinking about the world, as opposed to the West, which usually tries to reify things, and it does that with the epistemic structure and with the language it uses to interpret the world. So we have already in the ancient Greeks a dialectical perspective. We have in the PreSocratics a materialist perspective. So is Marxism just a synthesis of the dialectic of Aristotle and Plato and the PreSocratics? No. We have after them, we have a long period of idealism, of metaphysics, the Middle Ages, and then we have the Renaissance, and we have a period from the Renaissance all the way to Hegel, in which there's this constant back and forth of idealist and materialist tendencies. And what we find in the materialist tendencies is that they drag the sort of metaphysical, in the sense of how Marx and Engels use the word, as static, right? They drag this metaphysical approach. So we have a scientific revolution going on in that epoch, but the scientific revolution is one that is interpreting things in a way in which they're taken to be fixated and not dynamic. Things are not interpreted in a dialectical sense. And then we have other figures that are taking an idealist approach, but that are thinking about that are in their idealist approach taking a dialectical point of view. Most clearly here we have Hegel, whose dialectics serves as a pretty big inspiration for Marx. Marx says in the preface to the second German edition of Capital that he owes a lot to Hegel. Let me see if Capital Volume 1 is here. I can read out the quote. Right here. Here we go. So, let's see if I find it real quick. Second German edition. There we go. My dialectical method is not only different from the Hegelian, but it's its direct opposite. To Hegel, the life processes of the human brain, the process of thinking, which under the name the idea, he even transforms into an independent subject, is the demiurge. Demiurge is God, of the real world. And the real world is only the external phenomenon of the idea. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into the forms of thought. So here we have um, what's usually popular, a popularized view of thinking of Marx's dialectical method as an inversion of the Hegelian one, whereas Hegel sees the idea as the real in a sense, and the material world is really a reflection and abstraction of the idea. Marx sees it the other way around. It is from the material conditions that ideas arise, right? You first need to satisfy your hunger, and this is something we see as early as 46, 47 in the German ideology, right here, in which he says, in responding to the young Hegelians of the time, he is saying, hey, these people start from heaven. They try to know man by starting from heaven and then going to earth and trying to understand man. All right, we're not going to go from what men think about themselves. We're going to go from what men do, right? We're going to go from the material conditions of man and then interpret the thoughts, right? And then think about man, right? So what this is essentially is an inversion. You're not going from idea to material, but you're realizing that before you can think, you have to satisfy material needs. You have to satisfy hunger. And this is something that can even be seen before the German ideology in the manuscripts of 44. In that last section where he's dealing with Hegel, Marx goes into why we are natural beings. And the example, which is a very Semite example, right? Remember, Marx comes from a family of I think 4 generations of rabbis. His father wasn't a rabbi, he was a lawyer, but his uncle was a rabbi. And Marx here is using the metaphor of the stomach, of hunger, as that which pushes, that which establishes the relationship between me and nature. And we're natural beings because we have a necessity outside of ourselves in nature. All right, I don't want to get too carried away. It's very easy to do so. But he ends up saying, the mystifying side of Hegelian dialectic I criticized nearly 30 years ago. So this is the second edition. So he's criticizing this in the mid 40s, 44, 40, even 43 in the articles on his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. He's doing it there too. The mystifying side of the Hegelian dialectic I criticized nearly 30 years ago at a time when it was still the fashion. But just as I was working at the volume of Das Kapital, it was the good pleasure of the peevish, arrogant, mediocre, that's a Greek word, I don't read Greek, who now talk large and cultured Germany to treat Hegel in the same way as the brave Moses Mendelssohn in Lessing's time treated Spinoza, as a dead dog. I therefore openly avow myself the pupil of that mighty thinker, and even here and there, in the chapter on the theory of value, coquetted with the methods of expression peculiar to him. The mystification which dialectics suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him, it is standing on its head and must be turned right side up if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. Right? So what we have with Hegel is possibly the best formulation of the dialectic at the time. Hegel's not really using the terms dialectic, but it's essentially what it is, right? So I do, the first book I want to recommend is The Science of Logic, right? Which is really sort of laying out the method of the phenomenology of spirit. Hegel is very important to read, and this is not just me saying it as a philosophy student, grad student, whatever. But this is said by Lenin. Lenin says it in Materialism, Empirical Criticism, that we must read Hegel. That Hegel is a necessary read in order to really understand Marx. Although we can, understand Hegel pretty nicely with through Marx and Engels' works. All right, we're getting to like 20 minutes. I had to speed it up. So how does Marx's materialism, when I mean Marx and Engels' materialism, how does it differ from the ones before that? Well, the ones before that took a static view, a static view of things, and even though their methods were materialist, they were appealing to material, they took a static view. Others not only took a static view, but took what he calls um, a uh, there we go, an anti-human incorporeal materialism, right? And he's referring to specifically, this is in the Holy Family. This is the first text Engels and Marx write together in 1845. He's referring to Bacon and Hobbes, that their materialism has nothing to do with human people. It has nothing to do with life, and the relationships that humanity establishes within itself and different sort of social formations. So what's the kernel of the materialism that is present in Marx and Engels that sets it apart from any other materialism? First is that it takes an approach that centers in the human being. It centers in the material relations of human beings, not just material, but in the material relations of a human being. So it is a humanist materialism, and this is a concept that is sort of controversial in the Marxist tradition, because a lot of people have tried to appeal to the early Marx as the humanist Marx to sort of contradict some other things, but we shouldn't be scared. It is a humanist materialism. It is a materialism that starts with the human being. Humanism doesn't have to be the bourgeois humanism, right? Just like democracy doesn't have to be bourgeois democracy. We can get these terms and use them in our way, and I think our way of using them is perhaps more fair to the concept. So it's a humanist materialism. It starts with the human being, and the human being is material. It's a corporal being, but it's a being that is necessarily social, right? It exists in community. Humans cannot exist outside of community. It's necessarily laborious, and from being laborious, it becomes rational. And if you want an interesting read Dialectics of Nature, a chapter called which was an essay that he published separately, The Part Played by Labor in Transition from Ape to Man, where Engels argues that the role of the hand in labor, that's what ends up developing the mind. And further anthropologists from this century, Stephen Jay Gould, they confirm that thesis, which is brilliant. That's one of the things that anthropology has done. Anthropology has confirmed a lot, if not most, of the theses that Marx and Engels were not speculating on, but they were writing on, and in a time where they couldn't really prove it with the same certainty as the anthropological thesis. So another good text that does this is Ancient Societies by Henry H. Morgan, who was an American, and talks about the state and his discoveries. It's like if he's pulling it out of the German ideology, and he's not. It's right, and we're back. I'm sorry, my laptop died. But so I was mentioning that that the text, the part the part labor played in the transition from ape to man, um, is a very essential text that you guys have to read. It's one that's later confirmed by anthropologist Stephen Jay Gould. Um, and yeah, anthropology has generally been, without any sort of Marxist background, it has been confirming a lot of the theses that Marxism was bringing up as early as the mid 40s, 1840s. So we said that Marxist materialism is a humanist materialism, right? This is something that he says himself. It's a humanist and a militant materialism. He says it in manuscripts of 44. What else is it? It's a dialectical materialism, right? So the term itself, dialectical materialism, I believe, is introduced by Plekhanov, the Russian Marxist, right? But it is it's a dialectical materialism. Um, so what does that mean? Well, that it sees things not as fixated, not as either or, but it sees things as in a relationship with its opposite, right? Things are composed of polar opposites, and those polar opposites are in a constant relationship with each other, interpenetrating each other, and in that constant struggle, new things come about. And that's the kernel for for the scientific approach to socialism, right? Before Marx, it was socialism. Marx did not invent communism. He did not invent socialism. What he did was discover through scientific investigation that the appeal for socialism doesn't just have to be normative, that we don't have to cook up an ideal society from our brain, that the relationships that exist in the existing form of society are relationships that have not existed forever, that capitalism comes about in a very specific context, and that it develops specific forms of relationship between classes that are essential to it, and that in those relationships there are contradictions in which one can see that the system itself is not going to last. And the prediction is that out of those contradictions, the element that is going to be victorious, the pole that is going to be victorious, is the proletariat, the working class. And that's how we get to socialism. It's a scientific approach of socialism, not a utopic one. So, what do we have? A dialectical approach, right? With the dialectical approach, with the dialectical materialist approach, which it's later called diamat, we also have a historical approach. So material is not just treated as changing now, but it's treated in how it has come to be this way. It is treated in its historical context. So those are the three main things to understand the philosophical concept of materialism in Marx. It starts with a human being. It doesn't start with just matter. It starts with the human being, which is a material, natural, laborious, creative, rational being, right? Social being. It starts with the human being. It acknowledges change. It acknowledges that change has a structure that depends on contradictions, that the way that the world was being analyzed through previous forms of Aristotelian logic, where A is A cannot be both A and not A, that those sorts of fixations just weren't real, that in the world we have the dynamic of opposites and things are constituted by that dynamic of opposite states. So that's the dialectical approach. And we have um, a historical approach in Marxist materialism, which doesn't just look at how things are, but it looks at the historical reasons for why they are that way. So three things. Starts with the human, right, as a material being. It looks at things in a dialectical manner. Things change, and this is how they change, right? And it looks at things from a historical lens as well, right? So it doesn't try to separate, oh, this is how it is now, that's it, let's analyze it. It's not trying to do it as you do things in a lab, right? Even though lab studies of certain things do confirm dialectical approaches, right? Um, the Marxist lens thinks of things in its historical context. So, how does this help today? Is this a bunch of philosophical gibberish, right? Is this just philosophical jargon, and is it good for nothing? Um, to some extent, Marx and Engels were the first ones to say that philosophical jargon is in a sense worthless. And uh, as we see from Lenin, and of course it has its origins in Marx and Engels, all philosophy is class philosophy, right? Philosophers act like we're talking in this universal realm, and reality is that we're talking from a class perspective. And that our interests are usually aligned to the status quo, to the interests of the ruling class at the time. So in feudal society, the scholastic academics held up the interests of the aristocracy. In bourgeois society, the bourgeois academics, liberal academics or conservative, they held up the interests of capital. That's just the way things work. People who are in academia, who are um, against the structure of how things are the exception. They're not the rule, right? Um, so, what is what does this mean? Well, that on one end they're saying philosophy is kind of worthless, and again, here we have to interpret the dialectical approach. They're not just saying don't read philosophy. They're saying, or don't, yeah, they're not saying don't read philosophy. Like Engels says, you have to read philosophy. It's what's left of philosophy is just logic and the dialectic, but it's good to know how we got here, right? Um, and we see this with Lenin too in his speech to the communist youth leagues in 1920. He says we need to study everything that the bourgeois society has created, so that we can not everything, but what actually contributes to something. We don't have to be just memorizing how academia kind of works now, but we have to take what's useful and expand it. Socialism doesn't try to destroy the past; it tries to uh, um, destroy the contradictions that existed in the past that made certain things that are irrational possible. Like the fact that there's an abundance of food, there's food being thrown away everywhere, and yet there's people going hungry, even in the metropole, right? So it is important to know that the materialist approach starts from the human, is a dialectical approach, and it is a historical approach. So what does this serve us now? Just to write neat little philosophy books that are not really good for much? Um, no, we can use it in our practical everyday examination of 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 our world. Um, Eddie uh, Liger Smith, the other editor in this project, our comrade, he has a research focus in Venezuela. But how does he analyze Venezuela? Does he analyze Venezuela how it is now, and that's it? No. Does he analyze Venezuela how it's changing now, and that's it? No. He analyzes Venezuela from a historical context of how it was being a colony for a long time, of how it was being a colony that was made dependent on oil for a long time. He analyzes it in a manner in which it interprets, well, how did Chavez come in, the failed coup, the successful election, the blockade, the economic sanctions, right? He analyzes it in its historical context, right? We have stupid conservatives that talk about facts don't care about your feelings, right? It's not that we ignore facts. It's that facts are not just facts. Facts are not just there. They don't just happen to be there. They're there for a reason. And you don't understand what's there unless you understand the reason why it's there. So you need that historical approach, right? In order to understand things. You also need a dialectical approach to understand that there's certain contradictions in every society. To not just uncritically accept Maduro just because you're a socialist. To be able to critically engage with what are some of the flaws, what's going on here, right? Um, that dialectical approach that accepts that there's contradictions in things, and that those contradictions are at the basis of all change, of all progress. That's needed as well. And also a humanist approach, which starts from the real people of Venezuela. Not the white Venezuelans in Miami, right? Not the bourgeois Venezuelans behind Guaido, but the real working class Venezuelans, right? This is the Marxist framework. If you apply this framework anywhere in any of the socialist states, or anywhere in the world, this is what the Marxist framework consists of. You start from the human being, you interpret things dialectically, and you interpret things in its historical context. And this is the reason why we have to study these texts. All right, so I wanted to conclude by giving you where you should go to read on materialism. First, I'm gonna do it chronologically. The first book you must check out is The Holy Family. This is written in 1845 by Marx and Engels. The context page tells you who writes each chapter. Specifically, there's some good comments on the dialectic, I believe, in chapter 4. Yep. And yep, in chapter 4, there's good comments on the dialectic. And in chapter 6, we have a development of the the philosophical history of materialism. Right. That's important. You also should read, okay, I said I was going to go chronologically. The German ideology, that is where Marx first really systematizes the the approach of historical materialism, right? Of looking at history as the history of class struggles, right? As seeing the motor of history being the dynamic of classes and how the subsistence of the society overall is produced, right? And there's also a sort of um, an ontological basis in that text, which says that, well, the first act um, is an act of subsistence, an act of maintaining your own life, which is the one of eating and drinking, and that act requires production. So the motor of history, its genesis is in a productive act. The first act is a productive act, an act to meet the needs of humanity. Once you meet needs, once you have production, then you can start to think, or think abstractly and philosophically and stuff, and partake in rationality. So the German ideology, um, then you should read Engels. Engels is specifically the one who develops this probably the most. Check out The Dialectic of Nature. It's a book in which, in his studies, in scientific studies, he spends like 8 years studying just science, and writing articles on science, and seeing how it is that science works. And what he ends up confirming is that science works, that nature works in a way which confirms the dialectic. So he says nature is the test of the dialectics, right? And he says that the dialectics is interpreted in two ways: in objective dialectics, which is how it exists in the world, and subjective, which is when we're conscious of the dialectic of the world. So yeah, read Dialectics and Dialectics of Nature. Um, I recommend you get a newer copy with a good introduction, because usually in the introduction they'll catch you up to date on some of the topics and some of the scientific discoveries that just keep on confirming that things work in a dialectical manner. I recommend you read Anti-Düring, which is a book in which Engels is responding to Erdőring, and Erdőring's trash. You don't have to read him. You don't even have to read the passages that Engels quotes from her doing. They're essentially trash. But just read the comments, the positive side of the book, which is the comments where Engels expands, not just critiques during. Read the critiques, they're pretty funny. But yeah, read that. And then read, uh, this is a rare text, Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. It's perhaps, I think it's like 50 pages, 60 pages, 61 pages. It's very short, but it's very, very good. It goes from Hegel, Feuerbach, right? We didn't talk today about Feuerbach, but yeah, if you want to learn about materialism right before Marx, The Essence of Christianity from Feuerbach, um, and of course, uh, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. That again sort of mirrors some of the topics in the outcome of German philosophy. So I hope this video was helpful. I recognize I probably rambled quite a bit too much. It's really hard not to. Um, and I hope that you reach out and I hope that you read these texts that I recommended, because they will give you a phenomenal insight in what Marx and Engels mean by materialism, and that you use this lens to interpret reality, how it exists. It is in essence a critical lens of interpreting reality. Um, So yeah, thank you for watching the video. If you want to support us, consider a becoming a Patreon. If you don't have that money to help, that's fine. You can help us by sharing our content, either our articles, our YouTube videos, or anything else. As far as anti-during, right now we're doing a series. Um, that's why I'm rereading it now. We're doing a series by Dr. Thomas Riggins. He's been a Marxist academic for a very long time, and we have the pleasure to be publishing his series of 22 parts going through anti-Düring. So if you're too lazy to read the text, just hop on every Sunday on the website, and you'll see his article for the week. It's 22 of them, so that should help tremendously in helping you understand what Marx's materialist approach is all about. So, um, yeah, happy birthday, Engels. By the time this video is published, it will be his birthday, November 28th. Yeah, November 28th, 1820. And thanks for watching. See ya.